Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much for everyone who organized the events and for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here speaking with you all.
So I wanted to start our conversation today just with some basic background for those of us who may not be as familiar with the region. This brought up warm memories for me of having been in 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝗁, Amdo, many names, and particularly the community of Rebgong on which the book is centered. But for those of us who are maybe less familiar, talk to us a little bit about the situation in the region. What is the Manegacha language? Who is speaking it? What is its relationship to other languages in the region? And how does this all sort of interact with the Chinese state's system of ethnic classification?
Sure. Thanks for those questions to get the ball rolling. So I guess I'll just start out by pointing out that throughout the book, when I'm talking about Tibet, I'm not referring only to the Tibet autonomous region. I'm talking about the broader Tibetan cultural region, which is now split up into several provinces in China. So it includes parts of Qinghai, Gansu, Sichuan, and Yunnan provinces. And the site where I did most of the research for this book is in Qinghai province, which Tibetans refer to as the region of Amdo. So I worked with the Manegacha speaking community, which is in the around the town of Rongo in the region called Rebgong on the northeast Tibetan Plateau in Qinghai province. So Manegacha is a language it's basically descended from an old form of Mongolian. The Manegacha speakers have been living there on the northeast Tibetan Plateau for several centuries now, about 800 years they've been living there. Their language has been heavily influenced by Tibetan. Indeed, the name of the language, Manegacha, it means our language, and the gacha part is from the local Tibetan language, right? So even in the name of the language, it has some element of Tibetan in it. Um, so Manegacha is one of the languages that is spoken in Rebgong. Tibetan, the local variety of Amdo Tibetan, is the dominant language in the region. Most of the surrounding villages use that language, but there is also another minority language spoken in Rebgong, which is called 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝗁. 𝗘𝗃𝗲 is a kind of a Sinitic language. It's closer to other forms of Chinese than it is to other forms of Tibetan or Mongolian, for example. So you have this valley, basically. Rebgong is a valley full of villages and a growing urban center, large population of Tibetan speakers, and then a few villages scattered along the side of the valley that speak Manegacha and 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝗁. And this is kind of representative to some extent of the diversity that exists across Tibet. I think a lot of people come to thinking about Tibetan languages in Tibet with the assumption that all Tibetans speak Tibetan. This is unfortunately, yeah, this is misinformation. Tibet is a very linguistically diverse part of the world. The patterns of linguistic diversity that we see in Tibet sort of follow patterns of linguistic diversity that we see elsewhere in the world, where mountainous regions tend to be more diverse than sort of flat, plainy areas in terms of the number of languages that they have. So you mentioned that number, 60 minority languages. So when we talk about the minority languages in Tibet, that includes languages that are spoken by non-Tibetan ethnic groups that live inside Tibet. So these might be Mongolians, Nashi, Menba, Hlorpa, like minority ethnic groups. And then there are also linguistic minority groups who are basically Tibetan, but the language that they speak is not Tibetan. So there's roughly about 30 of those linguistic minority groups amongst Tibetans. And yeah, the research that I did focused on those Manegacha speakers in particular.
Great, thank you. One of the things that really emerges, especially from not only your introduction that you've given here, but from the early chapters of your book, is the idea of sort of multilingualism in the area, and that this is far from the sort of uniformly monolingual community that sometimes we might have been led to believe that it is. So, sort of moving on from that sort of introduction, then how do people in the area around Ronghua or Rebgong practice multilingualism or how or not in some cases? And what is the effect of that multilingualism on how speakers of Manegacha and other languages like it see themselves in relation to others in the community?
Yeah, thanks. So the practices of multilingualism in Rebgong and throughout China, I would say, are highly stratified. The languages exist in a hierarchy, and all of the practices align to those different hierarchies. So languages like Ngandahua and Manegacha are really at the bottom of those hierarchies, which and what that means essentially is that if you're not born speaking one of those languages, it's unlikely that you would end up learning one of those languages. However, if you're a Manegacha speaker, you would almost certainly have to learn other local languages and national languages just to sort of get around and get by in life. So if we take it from the perspective of a Manegacha speaker, for example, um, when you go to school, you start learning Tibetan and you start learning in Tibetan. And when you sit at home and you flick on the TV and you want to watch cartoons or something, you watch those either in Tibetan or some form of Chinese, right? Then when you go to high school, you would have to start learning 𝗱𝗃𝗁 like Mandarin Chinese. So if you're a Manegacha speaker, you will almost inevitably end up being trilingual, at least. Then others also know English. Um, However, if you're a local Tibetan person who doesn't speak Manegacha as a first language, you're almost certainly not going to learn it. You will use your language, your variety of Tibetan. You will have to learn Mandarin. That's compulsory for everyone, and so you'll almost certainly be bilingual. You can imagine then a someone who comes from outside the region, like a Han Chinese migrant who comes there to work in a government office or teach in the school or something like that. And they could potentially just get by only using Mandarin and would be unlikely to learn Tibetan. And it would be almost unheard of that someone in that position would learn to speak Manegacha or Ngandahua. So you can see that this hierarchy exists in who has to learn whose language and who has the luxury of being able to not learn certain languages. So that's a kind of like a rough idea of how contemporary multilingualism works in the region.
Thank you. One of the things I think is really interesting is how you have sort of approached this question from a theoretical standpoint, looking at this through a sort of Foucauldian lens about power. And the book really describes these sort of two systems of understanding sovereign power and biopolitical power. And I just wondered, you described sort of a shift from an area governed by sovereign power towards one governed by biopolitical power. I wonder what are the consequences of this shift and how has this sort of unfolded in sort of practical terms among speakers of Ngandahua or Manegacha in these regions?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So just explain briefly like why I felt it was important to develop that um theory. Like it would have been possible for me to just write an account of what was happening, like just an ethnographic descriptive work. But I felt that it was necessary to provide some kind of analysis of what was the underlying causes of the situation, because the kind of anthropology that I do is a more like applied anthropology that aims at creating, positive social change in the world. Without that political analysis, we can't really understand what's happening and we can't understand what has to be changed in order to intervene in the situation in positive ways. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, I suppose. But so I started working through this theory using Michel Foucault's idea of biopower and sovereign power. So basically, sovereign power is kind of a form of power that exists in the pre-modern state, the state of kings and queens and things like this. Biopower is associated with the modern state that we all know and enjoy today. Um, and Foucault's work traces the emergence of that shift from sovereign power to biopower in European states from sort of the 17 to 1800s. We saw that happen in in the Tibetan areas of China over a very rapid period of a few decades in the middle of the 20th century. It was a very sort of like hard and fast transition there. But to give a sense of like what that transition looks like, so sovereign power, the king rules, the king has extreme powers, power over life or death, basically. But the reach of the king into the everyday affairs of the people in the kingdom is very limited. So the king can kill you, but apart from that, the king doesn't really show up very often or do anything much in one's daily life. Under bio-sovereign conditions of the modern state, the state tends to, eschew the power to kill, but it takes over a power to sort of to govern life, to control, um, to guide, to encourage, to influence, to direct, and things like this. And the state becomes really present in our everyday life in new ways. So one way to think about this distinction is if you think about how tax gets paid. Under the sovereign, the king turns up once a year and shakes you down for your gold coins, and if you don't pay it, you're off with your head. Today, when we pay tax, it sort of comes out of your salary automatically, instantly. It's something that just is happening all the time and we don't even notice it. This works with language as well. Under sovereign power on the northeast Tibetan Plateau, this was kind of like before the emergence of the modern Chinese state. You had a warlord period, a warlord called Ma Bufang. And Ma Bufang didn't sort of govern people's everyday lives in very significant ways. He kind of showed up every now and then, shook people down for tax, dragged people off to be conscripts and things like this, but the government was not a big concern. And so the the system of governance in these communities across Tibet, I would say everywhere across Tibet, as well as in Qinghai, is best described as autarky. So a kind of like self-governing community. That doesn't mean that it was like non-hierarchical or free from authority, but it just means that the community governed itself. There were basically a committee of elders in the village who would make important decisions. There was a local monastery, which was a source of important religious authority. But when it came to making decisions about what language people would speak, people made that decision for themselves on a day-to-day basis. So in the Manegacha speaking villages, people spoke Manegacha to each other most of the time, and that was their language life. They would learn a little bit of Tibetan to interact with their neighbors. They would read Tibetan to chant religious scriptures, but no one was really guiding or governing that. When the modern state comes in, people have to start going to school, they have to start filling out paperwork, they have to interact with media. Initially, it's just propaganda from the Chinese state. Um, that propaganda is done through like public meetings, village level gatherings, things like this. Um, and suddenly people are not free to make those decisions about what language they want to use, what language they want to pass on to their children, and so on. Suddenly, language in the biopolitical state is something which is governed, and people's decisions are gradually shaped and guided by the state in new ways in response to incentives. So, you have to go to school. You're surrounded by the media. Your life is awash with propaganda and advertising. You have to get a job. All of these things require different languages, different uses of language, and so on. And people start getting forced into making decisions that they wouldn't have necessarily made in the past.
this is a really great explanation because I think it leads us right into the next question that I really want to ask about, which is the particular institution of ethnic classification that arises in the PRC after 1949. So one of the things that you really outline quite well in your book is the influence of this Minzu system, right? The system of ethnic classification. And I'm just curious, as an institution, what does this system of classification do to influence the sort of vitality or the sort of viability of languages like Manegacha, particularly with distribution of resources and things like you were just starting to mention? What is the sort of influence there?
Hmm. Yeah, thanks. So the Minzu system is kind of like ostensibly it is an ethnic classification system, but when it comes to languages, it's kind of a system which um, does two things. The Minzu system in relation to languages basically decides what languages exist and don't exist in the eyes of the state. And then secondly, amongst the languages that do exist, it creates a hierarchy between them and distributes resources accordingly. So between the languages that exist and don't exist, the official position is that there are 56 Minzu in China, one Han majority and 55 minorities. Um, each of those Minzu is supposed to have one language because they are nations, right? In the same way that, European nations, French, French in France, German in Germany, etc., right? Which never was real, but it was the ideal of the nation state was supposed to look that. So China is organized as um, there's a phrase from the study of Russia, a scholar called Francine Hirsch referred to it as an empire of nations, right? And China was organized along similar lines, where the Minzu system classified everyone in China into one of 56 Minzu, and each of those Minzu was supposed to have a language, right? There's 300 languages in China, probably around 300 languages. So when you have 56 Minzu with one language each, everything beyond that just gets cut out. Those languages don't exist from the perspective of the state. So those languages are downgraded to the status of a dialect. When you have a dialect rather than a language, you don't get funding, you don't get institutions, you don't get media, you don't get representation, you don't get resources, you don't get anything. Those languages just get completely shut out, right? Interestingly, we like in China studies, people often talk about like ethnic politics in terms of like Han domination over minorities, which is a valid way of thinking about it. But when we look at it from languages, a lot of those languages that get completely cut out are Han languages as well, right? So what we would think of, like what the average person on the street in Manchester would think of as Chinese, is not a language. It's a group of related languages which share a writing system, right? And so a lot of the Han languages get cut out of that as well. No resources, no funding, no institutional reproduction. And so that's an assimilatory force. When you provide no support for a language, that drives people into better supported languages. So most of the languages in China get pushed into that situation. Then you have the remaining 56 languages, and there is a clear hierarchy amongst those where you have um, 普通话, the national language, Mandarin Chinese at the top. That is compulsory for everyone in China to learn. That's mandated by law. There are massive resources put into universalizing the language. There are targets set to increase the percentage of people in the country who speak 普通话 and so on. Then the other 55 languages, which are the designated single minority languages for each of the minorities, like they're optional. You can use them. There are laws that say that they could be used, they should be used, but there's nothing making any of those languages compulsory in any situation at all. And so that creates again an incentive structure where people are driven towards 普通话 at the expense of those minority languages.
Thank you. Uh, Following on from this discussion of China as an empire of nations, one of the things that very strongly comes through in the book, and that I think people might find a bit surprising or may not have considered, is the idea of nationalisms, plural, competing, and what that does to the sort of survival or the ability to survive of languages like Manegacha, and especially by these notions of sort of monolithic national identities, notions of linguistic purity and things like this. I wonder if you
Mm.
might talk a little bit in this specific case, how these competing nationalisms play out. What does it do to the positioning of speakers of Manegacha and other similar languages as these nationalisms compete?
Sure. Yeah. So like one of the things that I try carefully to unpack in the book is the fact that the Chinese state itself promotes Tibetan nationalism. I think people find that an unusual thing to hear because they conflate the idea of nationalism with separatism or something like this. So, nationalism in this sense just means the idea that you have a group of people who are unified by a common language, living in a shared territory with a collective identity. Right? That's what nationalism is. And that's what a Minzu is. A Minzu is a nation, right? This idea kind of travels from Europe through the Soviet Union. It also goes around the other way into Japan. And when the Chinese Communist Party is setting up how they're going to govern, they take this nation idea from those diverse sources and use it as a governing framework. And so Tibetan is governed as a nation by the Chinese state. The Chinese state mandates Tibetans to be a nation, right? So you have that state-imposed nationalism on Tibetans, which means that um, insofar as Tibetans have any claim to language in China, it is only to a single Tibetan language. And that's never stated clearly, right? There's no explicit policy that says Tibetans can only learn Tibetan, but in practice, what that's the language which is supported. And so in that context, they just mean the written language, right? So when the Chinese state has policies to promote Tibetan, which it does have, they mean promoting the written language primarily. So you also then have a kind of like grassroots nationalism amongst Tibetans, which is informed by the state's nationalism, um, but has different priorities, different manifestations, different um, goals, and different resonance for people. So you mentioned this idea of linguistic purity. This has become a real key aspect of Tibetan nationalism in the period that I was there. So I lived in Qinghai from 2005 to 2013, and I was continuing the research on this project basically from 2013 to 2018. So there was a couple of important events that happened in that span of time. So 2008 was the Tibetan uprisings that started in Lhasa in March of that year, and then went on to become the largest political protest amongst Tibetans in modern China, right? From that, there was this kind of like national awakening amongst Tibetans, and you had Tibetan intellectuals writing at this time saying, we all just thought of ourselves as people who like had the same Minzu and maybe lived across the same plateau, but now we've woken up to our identity as a nation, our destiny as a nation, and our responsibility as a nation as well. And so from this, you started to see a movement like around 2008 to 2010, there was this movement that emerged to promote what they called 𝗱𝗲𝘁, which is a Tibetan word. It literally means pure father tongue. So 𝗱𝗲𝘁, father tongue, is like the national language for Tibetans. And so the pure father tongue movement, like linguistic purism, is basically xenophobia with words, right? It's where you try to construct a language that doesn't have any foreign elements in it. So the Tibetan language, like every language, has words from other languages. There was like studies from the early 20th century tracing the origin of different words in Tibetan, and you can, Central Asian languages, South Asian languages, or Inner Asian, Mongolian, Chinese loanwords, and so on. But this program of lexical of linguistic purism amongst Tibetans, this grassroots nationalist program, was specifically about getting rid of Chinese loanwords because you had this long situation of like very intense compulsory promotion of Chinese to Tibetan speakers, where people were losing vocabulary in their own languages, and this was particularly pronounced with new stuff, right? Like cell phones, internet, etc., etc., etc. When these things came up, people just were calling them by the Chinese names, right? So these pure father tongue associations started to appear in villages saying like, no, there are Tibetan words for this stuff. Let's remember it. Let's learn it. Let's use it. Let's teach each other. Let's hold competitions. Let's insult people if they don't use the Tibetan word for it. Um, and things like this, like very, very active, widespread language movement that really suffused daily life for Tibetans at that time. Like the thing that gets complicated and how the minority languages like Manegacha get drawn into this is that a, a lot of Tibetans view these minority languages not as distinct languages at all, but just kind of like broken Tibetan, mixed up Tibetan, eroded or polluted Tibetan. So while there's this drive to sort of assert cultural and linguistic autonomy by getting rid of loan words, people start turning around and looking at these like Manikacha speakers, and they're like, well, they're speaking in this mixed language, so and they're Tibetan, and so we need to reform their way of speaking. We need to get them to speak pure Tibetan, proper Tibetan, like clear Tibetan, and things like this. So after decades of like really intense assimilatory pressure from the state, Manikacha speakers are suddenly faced with this new situation where the Tibetans around them are also saying, you need to stop it with that Manikacha language. You need to start speaking correct Tibetan and be part of the Tibetan nation. So it's this kind of, it's hard to see if it's really a backfire or of state policy, or it's just a more like cunning layer to the way that state assimilation policies work by recruiting other Tibetans to recruit Tibetan to assimilate Tibetans.
So on that end, I think one of the sort of interesting developments that you talk about at length in your book is the idea of how this reverberates even outside the PRC. That the sort of other Tibetans in this equation also include, Tibetans in the community in exile, part of this community that you call global 𝗘𝗃𝗁, right? And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit of what you mean by that term, and sort of who's a part of this arrangement and how it contributes to the sort of marginalization of Manegacha speakers, or the sort of notion that they're not part of a Tibetan linguistic community.
Yeah, sure. So global 𝗘𝗃𝗁, it's kind of like on one level, it's just a descriptive term which aims to just put a label on all the people around the world who speak Tibetan. But on the other hand, it also refers to like a more normative project where people are trying to bring together all the Tibetan speakers and then bring together some other people who should be speaking Tibetan within this nationalist framework, right? So it's an effort to create a community around the Tibetan language. And there's kind of like a large dispersed infrastructure to this project stretched around the world. So at the center of it, I would say, is the Tibetan government in exile in India. So, the Dalai Lama and senior officials in the government, and many other Tibetans fled in 1959 after an uprising in Lhasa. There was an ongoing uh, process of people fleeing into exile for decades afterwards, which didn't really, which wasn't really halted until after the 2008 uprisings, and the border was really sealed after that. But so, you have decades of Tibetans leaving China, setting up in exile. They have a governing structure there. Um, some of the writing about the Tibetan government in exile talks about it having a high degree of stateness. It's a really well organized, sustained effort. They have deliberate policies around language and education for Tibetans in exile all around the world. They have embassies, sort of embassies and outreach offices in different countries around the world. So you have the Tibetan government in exile, and their language policy is the same as the Chinese government's language policy at its root, which is all Tibetans have one language. That language is Tibetan. So even though in the diaspora there are Manegacha speakers in the diaspora, right? But the Tibetan government in exile only promotes a single Tibetan language to them and to all other Tibetans around the world. In addition to the government in an exile, you have a vast network of NGOs, some of which are formally aligned with the Tibetan government in exile, some of which are not. The thing that I found really challenging to think through is that a lot of the relationships between these NGOs that focus on Tibet, like there's competition and animosity amongst them. They don't agree on tactics and strategies and end goals. So for example, you have Tibetan organizations which promote um, complete independence from China, and you have others which promote greater autonomy within China. And there's a lot of animosity and conflict between those different NGOs, and yet despite the fact that they don't see eye to eye on things, they all agree on this what seems like a simple fact of all Tibetans having a single Tibetan language. In much the same way that the Tibetan exile government and the Chinese state don't see eye to eye on a great many things, but they do agree on this one simple idea that all Tibetans have a single language and that language is Tibetan. So it's interesting to try and analyze these kind of complex political relationships where you have like uh, enemies in alliance over particular issues. So Tibetan government in exile, networks of NGOs. Um, you also have like NGOs like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. They're recruited into these projects as well. Human Rights Watch, in particular, has written several reports about education and language issues in Tibet. And then you also have governments like state governments, like the US government has a legal obligation to provide financial support for the Tibetan cause. There's a US Tibet Policy Act, which was just revised this year. There's a new version of it that has just been passed, and that commits the US government to providing a certain level of funding, to taking stances on particular issues. It creates a particular office that exists to promote Tibetan issues within the US and on global stages and so on. And so like the Tibetan cause has for many decades become this like uh, really complex network of actors all around the world with different strategies, different ideas, but all pushing this same idea that Tibetans only have a single language. So even though none of these people are the origin of the assimilatory pressures on Manegacha speakers and others, they also don't do anything to confront that assimilatory pressure that comes from the state.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation. I think it really helps to sort of contextualize and understand. As we sort of draw towards a close, I want to leave some time for Q&A. One of the things that I think is quite powerful about the book and is really illustrative is the not just the big picture focus that you provided, which is excellent, but also the sort of deeply ethnographic examinations of what the sort of effects of this sort of linguistic marginalization feel like for individual speakers of Manegacha in their own communities. And I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about that, just to, for those of us who have not had the privilege that I have had of reading the book, to let them sort of know sort of how does this feel in real life? How do people in the Manegacha community internalize or cope with or navigate these kinds of oppressions or marginalizations?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So I left this part of the book until last because essentially I think it's the most important. Like a lot of the book is dealing with big structural issues of like state policy, theories of governing global networks of power, state building and stuff like this. But what really matters is how this manifests in people's day-to-day lives and influences their decisions. So the book has this phrase language oppression in the title, so I should probably define what that means. Like language oppression, it occurs when people are coerced into giving up their language and taking up a dominant language. And how that often happens is intergenerationally, so that parents will choose to withhold the community or the heritage language from their children and to only pass on the dominant language to their children. So in the case of Manegacha, that's Tibetan because that's the locally dominant language. And I did a bunch of household surveys in the four villages where Manegacha is spoken. And it's like about a third of the households are currently no longer passing on that language to their children. And there's indications from some of the other parts of the survey that that is probably increasing and going to continue increasing. And so the question really is essentially why are people making that choice, right? And so part of the reason why they make that choice is because Tibetan and Mandarin, Putonghua would provide their children with greater opportunities in life, right? Provides them with opportunities to get employment, but also to belong to a national community that is significant to them, to be Tibetan and to be accepted as Tibetan. Because currently, to speak Manegacha is to be not really accepted as fully Tibetan by other Tibetans in 𝗱𝗲𝘁. And basically, for Manegacha speakers, the degree of sort of discrimination and disrespect that they face in their day-to-day life is exactly proportional to the amount of time they spend with Tibetan speaking Tibetans, right? So whenever they are around other Tibetans, they're subject to this really fine scale monitoring of their language, waiting for them so they would be speaking Tibetan with other Tibetans, but the way that they speak Tibetan is a little bit different. Pronunciation is different, some grammatical differences in the way that they speak, and other Tibetans would be monitoring that constantly, waiting for them to slip up. And when they slip up, they will, maybe just a gentle correction, but it might be a joke, right? You might become the butt of someone's joke, or it might be more serious. It might lead to a conflict, right? Where there's anecdotes that I collected in the story about conflicts between Manegacha speakers and other Tibetans, where they had been insulted and then things had come to blows. But there's more serious forms of discrimination against Manegacha speakers. There was examples of hate speech that I collected from online, where people kind of were just openly expressing disdain and hate for Manegacha speakers and 𝗀𝗲𝘁 speakers, insulting their languages, insulting them, saying that they were a threat to the Tibetan nation and things like this. So for Manegacha speakers, it's just a constant grind of daily discrimination and insult and disrespect from other Tibetans. And this is the real direct driver of a lot of the decision making that Manegacha speakers today face. They're not just trying to provide their children with opportunities, they're trying to save them from bad experiences that they've had.
Yeah. I think one more question before we turn over to Q&A. I think we're about at that time. We've given this sort of excellent overview of the situation, and I think we've looked at micro and macro levels. I know that, making predictions or thinking about the future is often hard to do, but just in your position as somebody who has observed this very closely for a very long time, what do you think the future of these communities, 𝗀𝗲𝘁, Manegacha, the sort of linguistic communities of the Eastern Tibetan Plateau. What does that
Mhm.
look like if nothing changes, or what is the sort of future hold?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, no one can predict these things, but we can make very good guesses, particularly because we're looking at languages survive by being passed from one generation to the next. And we can look at those processes over time and see the direction that they are taking and sort of project that forward. So, like Manegacha, if we project the situation forward, fewer and fewer people are going to speak this language. And by the end of the century, there will be no Tibetans in 𝗱𝗲𝘁 who speak Manegacha anymore. I would say the same about 𝗱𝗲𝘁 as well. One of the projects that I did during the research for this book was that I did an expert survey of linguists who study these minority languages in Tibet. And I couldn't get people who work on all 30 odd languages, but I managed to get some like good, well-informed opinion on 20 of these minority languages that are spoken across Tibet. And in every case, they said that the language was threatened and that the number of speakers was declining and that intergenerational transmission of the languages was collapsing, that the languages were not being passed on to the future. When I asked them, do you think the language will still be spoken in 100 years' time? Uh, Only one of the experts said yes for their particular language. So there's kind of widespread recognition amongst experts, as well as from my own ethnographic studies, that these minority languages in particular, they're very threatened. The numbers are collapsing right now, and they're not going to be here in the decades to come if something drastic doesn't change right now.